What I want to do over the next 30 minutes or so is to explore with you some concepts which have really beguiled me over the last decade or so in relation to ethnicity and race and culture, and how they've been explained in the literature, or more frequently not explained. And I think it's important that I draw my land in the sand in relation to how I understand them, in order to make sense of what I then want to talk about, which is the relationship between multiple sclerosis, neurological disease, and its interface with culture and ethnicity. I want to talk about what's known in relation to these very important issues, and very importantly, what isn't known, particularly in the United Kingdom, where we're seeing increasing numbers of people from Black, Asian and minority ethnic communities now living with MS, a phenomenon which was previously didn't exist at all for very interesting reasons. And I want to focus specifically on the study that I conducted with my colleagues Irene Higginson, Eli Silber, Rachel Berman, Diana Jackson and others just a couple of years ago, which we've recently had published in a journal called PLOS ONE. And very importantly, I want to explore with you what does that mean at the clinical interface. So perhaps we'll have a little opportunity for a discussion later on. So firstly, each year the number of papers that focus on race and ethnicity and culture in relation to medicine and health services research almost increases exponentially. But what troubles me is that there's so much conceptual sloppiness in relation to how those concepts are then delivered in the articles. They're often used interchangeably with some other, and they're often conflated with other really interesting social metrics like class, poverty, and education. It frustrates me that the authors aren't upfront about what these terms mean to them, and I'm a stickler when it comes to concepts and words. So let's start with race. It has a really long and inglorious history. And its history is wedded to awful moments in time, particularly the Second World War, particularly in relation to what happened in the former Balkans, and of course in Rwanda. The 19th century scientists were besotted with this notion of race, and they wanted to try and demonstrate the biological worth of people based on important metrics such as stature, hair colour, colour of skin. And some of them were very interested in this notion of phrenology in order to build some kind of standing in relation to who's who and how they relate to society and their social worth. Some of you might be familiar with a guy called Blumenbach, who discovered some very elegant skulls in the Caucasus Mountains. These skulls were associated with a loftier mentality compared to skulls that he then discovered on the African subcontinent. Hence, these beautiful skulls were referred to as Caucasian. And again, that term is frequently littered in the American literature, and I have a real issue with it, particularly because the history of race is associated with people like Francis Galton, Paul Broca, and John Down. This is a really bad way of viewing social difference and diversity in society. Ethnicity is a slightly more palatable term, and it's one that I frequently use, and it's one that clinical epidemiologists often use in terms of understanding who's making use of what in relation to health and social care. Its word goes back to the Greek word meaning people or tribe, and I like the definition by Raj Bhopal in the British Medical Journal several years ago that suggests that it relates to a group of people within a larger society who share a common ancestral origin, or social background, or culture and traditions that are maintained between generations and provide a sense of identity. My issue in relation to this is how do we measure it? And it's quite a slippery concept in relation to how we rather artificially group many people under one single term, for example, Asian, until the Office of National Statistics decided back in 1991 to subcategorize that, and then in subsequent censuses to break it down even more. But the level of imprecision in relation to ethnicity is very difficult for people to get their head around, and also very difficult for jobbing researchers like myself. I like the concept of culture, and again, it's portrayed in a number of different ways in the literature, but I really like the definition. It kind of refers to a recipe for living in the world. We each comprise a number of different ingredients that make us who we are, coming from North London, across the Blackfriars Bridge every morning into gritty southeast London, provides a whole repertoire of very interesting and different ingredients that I have to get my head round. And if you're interested in culture, I could think of no better book than than this book here by Kate Fox, who's a jobbing anthropologist from the University of Cambridge, who attempted to understand British social, cultural mores. How do people make sense of the colour of the tea that they drink? And what she very interestingly did was to push into queues at train stations to understand how people responded to the social mores and the currency of a queue. If you're interested in ethnicity and race, I could think of no better book than The Mismeasure of Man by Stephen Jay Gould. In fact, I'm indebted to this book in helping me understand what these concepts are all about. I've got some more books there that you might want to read later on. So let's think about multiple sclerosis, which is what you're really all here to hear. It's a chronic immune-mediated demyelinating disease of the central nervous system that's characterised by relapses and remissions. And clinically, people with MS show a variety of neurological signs and symptoms attributed to white matter lesions which are disseminated in time and space within them. And it's associated with a whole kind of panoply of different symptoms that include numbness, motor weakness, visual disturbances, poor coordination, dizziness and vertigo, as well as fatigue and pain and many, many other symptoms. But when you start to examine some of the presumptive factors that are associated with the cause of MS, it becomes very difficult to disaggregate what exactly is going on. Some people believe that it's associated with immunological deficiencies and factors associated with a dozen different viruses, including Epstein-Barr virus, as well as environmental factors in terms of being exposed to ultraviolet radiation, and of course vitamin D is being postulated as another really interesting and plausible reason why people get it. But what we do know from MS is that it follows a really interesting geo-epidemiological pattern in terms of its distribution across the world that's associated with latitudinal gradients. People closer to the equator experience less MS than those in more temperate climates. The reasons for that, again, are fairly poorly understood. And a very good paper that's focused on this is by Milo and Kahana, two clinicians from Israel. So what do we know about MS and ethnicity? We do know that ethnicity is thought to influence the clinical manifestation of a disease. So, for example, there are people like Naismith and Jonathan Koffman, amongst many others, who've shown that African Americans and some other ethnic groups in the States experience far more aggressive disease and far greater levels of disability than what they always refer to as Caucasian Americans. Again, I told you I have a real issue with that word, but I'll let them play with it. There's also growing evidence, again, principally from the States, from people like Cree and others, that show that African Americans fare far less well in relation to disease-modifying therapies, again, compared to their white peers. The reasons for that, again, are very poorly understood. We know so little about the disease. I think something which is important to state in relation to this very interesting relationship between ethnicity and MS is that most of the studies that I've shown you on the previous slide, and certainly these two by Elian and Dean, almost exclusively rely on data extracted from clinical notes. Now, these are really important, groundbreaking studies, but I think the problem with these studies is that they are hemmed in by that really important limitation. They don't speak to the people with MS about their lived experiences of their illness, how they make sense of it, and then to how they live alongside it. And I think one of the other major limitations with some of the studies that I've alluded to is that they concentrate principally on people with MS in the earlier stages rather than the later stages, where psychosocial concerns and physical concerns may be very different again. So it's for this reason that we were very generously given some money by the Multiple Sclerosis Society several years ago to conduct, I think, one of the first studies in the United Kingdom to really explore patient-centered experiences of multiple sclerosis, or at least severe multiple sclerosis, across two ethnic groups. And I would be remiss if I didn't credit my co-researchers who worked with me on this. Certainly Irene, Eli Silber, Rachel Berman, Diana Jackson, who have I missed out? Pauline Shaw and Fiona Barnes, who are the clinical nurse specialists who work very closely with us, and of course my research assistant, Cassie Goddard, who really make this study float. It captured quite a lot of media attention when we published the paper last year. This was the Times in Ireland and the Evening Standard in London. So what was this study all about? Well, our aim was really to describe and compare for the first time the experiences of multiple sclerosis, severe multiple sclerosis, across 2 ethnic groups. And we wanted to compare 2 rather than focusing specifically on the Black Caribbean community, because we believe that focusing on a single community suggests that it might be exotic, different, idiosyncratic compared to the wider population. We wanted to see if there were similarities and also, very importantly, if there were differences between the 2 groups of people and how we could understand why those differences might exist. And I think very importantly as well, there's relatively little qualitative research that's explored the experiences of severe multiple sclerosis in white British people, apart from the work that Irene and Polly Evans and Rachel Berman and Eli Silber conducted just a few years ago now. So we wanted to build on that. So let's talk very quickly about the anatomy of the study that we conducted, because it was interesting. We undertook a mixed method study amongst these 2 ethnic groups, white British people and Black Caribbean people, severely affected by multiple sclerosis. We made use of a variety of different sources of data. We drilled down on their clinical notes to extract interesting data around their date of onset of their illness from the point of diagnosis, and very importantly, the different points in time when they experienced functional decline. We interviewed face-to-face a good number of people across both communities using structured interviews and validated measures. And we also incorporated with that what we refer to as a nested qualitative component, where we selected a subsample from both groups of people with multiple sclerosis to talk to them in much more detail about their lived experience of MS, how they made sense of it, and what bothered or troubled them most about their illness. And I think compared to mono-methods research, I think the beauty of mixed method research is it provides a number of really interesting vantage points to ask different, but very importantly, intersecting questions, and then thinking about the study from its conception all the way through to different points into data collection, and finally to integrate these 2 silos of data in order to say something which is larger than the sum of its parts. So this study took place in South East London. It incorporated 2 NHS trusts and 6 primary care trusts, and overall I think we must have taken in about 1.6 million people en route in terms of working out who these patients would be. And you'll be aware that King's and the hospital in Greenwich, Queen Elizabeth Greenwich, are places where the multiple sclerosis service operates with great gusto. But in order to minimise the possibility of not including people who were living in South East London and were not receiving care from the teams at King's or in Greenwich, we also made use of a voluntary sector organisation called the Shame Project to potentially identify people who were being seen elsewhere in London. So the study became a pan-Thames study within a very short period of time. So who were we interested in? We were interested in people who were over the age of 18. We were interested in people who had a confirmed diagnosis of multiple sclerosis, confirmed by a neurologist using the McDonald criteria, and also that they had an expanded disability status scale or an EDSS score of 6 and above. And that suggests that they'd have considerable difficulty walking about 100 metres without the aid of Zimmer frame or a walking stick or another similar aid. They had to self-identify as being Black Caribbean or white British. That was very important. They had to possess sufficient cognitive capacity or cognitive impairment, so in order that they could consent to complete the interviews. And that was determined by the referring clinicians. But in addition to that, my colleague Cassie Goddard wasn't satisfied with their views alone in terms of identifying those who might have had issues around mental capacity or confusion or memory loss. And she suggested that we use the Blessed Orientation Memory Concentration Test as well. It's super quick to complete, it's very, very easy, and it has a scale ranging from 0 to 28, where a cutoff of 15 suggests that people might have increased cognitive impairment that would suggest that they would not be appropriate for our study. And I'll get onto when we use this later on. Oh, this is the scale itself. It's very, very simple to complete. We asked our participant what year it is now, what month it is, and within the space of several minutes, it's possible to complete and work out who we would really be interested in talking to and who we would have to have a chat with and suggest that there were issues that meant that they could not be incorporated into our study. So after our folk provided informed consent, we extracted clinical diagnosis from their data, from their records. We also worked out when they reached different stages of functional decline according to their EDSS scales. Again, that data was embedded in their clinical notes. And then we conducted face-to-face interviews with these individuals. And we asked them to report when they first experienced symptoms of MS, when they had, which we refer to as onset disease. And then we asked them to report a whole range of different symptoms associated with multiple sclerosis, the services that they used, and very importantly, the distress associated with different symptoms that they were experiencing. And it was at this point that we had made use of a very extensive systematic review conducted by David Grunwald and Irene to identify and appraise questionnaires that would be relevant to this particular group of people. We specifically made use of a multiple sclerosis impact scale, the modified fatigue impact scale, the hospital anxiety and depression scale that many of you might be familiar with, and of course most people in the audience here will know about the Palliative Care outcome scale and the POS symptoms MS. Within that, we wanted to speak to a small subsample of people who were willing to share much more time with us to explore the meanings associated with the multiple sclerosis. How do they make sense of it? What were the main sorts of issues that bothered or troubled them about their illness? And what were the sorts of services that they were interested in making use of? These were very informal interviews, more like chats or discussions, where typical questions included asking our participants to tell us in their own words what bothered or troubled them about their illness. And all these interviews were audio recorded, and we made extensive field notes en route in order to supplement these sorts of interviews, to understand much more about them. So this is who we approached. We have the enormous luxury of identifying 97 people with MS. 46 of them were Black Caribbean, 51 of them were white British, and within that, many, many individuals wanted to share their time with us, which was an enormous privilege. 43 Black Caribbean and 44 white British people said, we're really interested in talking to you. When can we make a time to meet, to be interviewed? We had to exclude one of the white British individuals because the BMOC score suggested that they did have cognitive impairment, although their clinicians thought that they would have been okay. But we went with the test. It was much safer to do it that way. And in the end, we had 43 people in each group. I think just a quick note about the conduct of the actual interviews, because it's always interesting to reflect methodologically on what we did. Following Koffman, Kathy and I were really conscious about the front that we presented during the course of the interviews. And this is something that we discussed in considerable detail before we commenced the field work. We wanted to enhance the internal validity of all our interviews, and we wanted to try and attempt to build a more collaborative approach between our participants and us as jobbing researchers. We wanted to move away from the standard interviewing paradigm where the interview possesses all the power in terms of the questions that they ask, and then how they make sense of the data. And what struck us was how many participants really wanted to go above and beyond their MS experience to tell us warts and all about who they were. Rachel Stanworth suggests that this is a way that participants attempt to convert researchers to what she refers to as credible witnesses. And I think one of the great strengths that Cassie brought to the research wasn't just the questions that she asked, and she did that beautifully, but was also her very patient silence. And with that silence, I think she gave our participants permission to talk, to tell us about them. And another note in relation to this was how we were very conscious that we needed to suspend what we refer to as our conventional expectations about multiple sclerosis and what it represented to our participants. We had to separate ourselves from the idea that MS was an altogether catastrophic illness. People living with multiple sclerosis, with this shopping list of different symptoms, was the worst thing that could happen in their life. And I know a number of participants clearly regarded their MS as catastrophic and in some senses dwelled on impending death. There were a number of participants who made us see through these very, very interesting interviews that their MS had to be seen against a much broader, much richer backdrop of other events that had occurred during their lives. And it's at this point that we had to suspend these conventional expectations. People spoke of mental illness, people spoke of breakup with partners, and these were things which were far more corrosive than the mere diagnosis of multiple sclerosis and how they travelled with that illness for a good number of years. Longacre puts it really succinctly when he suggests that when you listen to someone, you kind of hear an echo of yourself, of your own opinion. And I think we do this all the time. Men do it particularly when we complete sentences on behalf of people. And we had to be very attuned to that and listen very attentively to what people were saying. And Cassie did that exquisitely. So who were we successful in terms of recruiting? We recruited 43 people in each group. Most of our participants were born in the UK, apart from 9 of our Black Caribbean folk who were born in the former West Indies. About 2/3 of them were women. They were white. Black Caribbean participants were typically younger than their white British peers. There were a whole range of different MS types, including relapsing remitting. More than a third had secondary progressive MS, and slightly more than a third had primary progressive or primary relapsing multiple sclerosis. Our white British people with MS were typically diagnosed for far longer periods than their Black Caribbean counterparts. And they were also treated with a whole range of disease-modifying therapies, including interferon B and glatiramer, amongst other drugs. So I gave you a very short shopping list of the different measures that we used, and using the POS-S, we identified that Black Caribbean and white British people with MS had a mean of about 9 symptoms. 14 of the 18 symptoms were rated as severe and overwhelming. And that's really important. These were symptoms which were very, very distressing indeed to the individuals who were experiencing them. And that was especially so for fatigue and pain and issues in relation to ambulation. So after adjusting for age and type of MS and the EDSS score, I told you earlier relates to functional decline, there were very, very few differences between these two groups of people, to the point where it would be almost impossible to get a cigarette paper between them, which is really interesting. But that was with the exception of pressure sores, where it was far more of a problem, according to our Black Caribbean participants. We recorded no difference in relation to the MSSS scale. Again, roughly 22 areas of concern for Black Caribbean and 23 for white British people. Again, these similarities are very, very important. And if we focus on fatigue using the MFIS and also anxiety and depression using the hospital anxiety and depression score, again, there were very, very few differences between the two groups of people. What really interested us was that there was a very interesting difference in relation to reports of cognitive impairment across the two groups. You'll remember we used this very interesting measurement tool to screen out people who were maybe cognitively impaired. But what it did show us was that Black Caribbean people with MS had 1.5 times greater likelihood of experiencing mental confusion compared to their white peers, even after taking all other factors into consideration. So now on to some very interesting data, because what we wanted to do was to make use of an embedded qualitative component to talk to our participants, to a smaller number, 15 in each group, about the lived experience of MS or severe multiple sclerosis. And we asked them again to tell us what bothered or troubled them about their illness, and what we showed was that there were some very interesting issues around pain and fatigue and memory loss and confusion, and also psychological problems. And I think one of the main symptoms that participants spoke about was fatigue, and they described this physical sensation using a number of different terms, like feeling tired and sleepy and dozy. They felt weak, they lacked energy, they had lethargy wasn't a common word, and they also incorporated kind of metaphorical descriptions that went above the kind of physical sensations that may be very important to us. A very interesting 69-year-old white British woman with secondary multiple sclerosis referred to her lack of energy as running out of steam. And then a 60-year-old Black Caribbean woman, again with secondary progressive multiple sclerosis, described her figures equivalent to pulling out of electrical plugs. And she said to us, although the other symptoms were more frightening, if I didn't have the fatigue, I'd be okay. I'm not just getting tired, it's like somebody pulled out the plug. Somebody pulled out the plug and phew, it's all gone. Living with MS is like living with a mobile phone battery. Every task I do uses up the battery. And you end up with a house which is an absolute mess, your room is an absolute mess, your papers are an absolute mess, your life is an absolute mess. So back to this credible witness phenomenon, because some participants started out suggesting that they have enormous difficulty describing their experiences to us. They weren't quite sure that they were able to do it. And there was a 40-year-old black Caribbean gentleman with relapsing remitting multiple sclerosis who hesitated for a few moments before attempting to convey his experience to us. And then he managed to provide a really evocative description of how his fatigue was lived out. He said, it feels as if you've got weights all over you. You know, it's as if you get up in the morning and you feel like you're just being dragged down by lead weights around your arms and your legs, and it's like attached to your body all over the place, and it's pulling you down. You get out of the chair and you flop down, basically. Everything's like a mission. Sometimes I can't be asked to make breakfast. I wake up feeling hollow, just empty. A lot of the times I just go back to bed, to be honest. They also spoke extensively about psychological problems associated with living with multiple sclerosis, and they made use of a variety of different words here again, like feeling depressed, feeling low, grey, sad, lacking motivation, and being down in the dumps. And this is where a 46-year-old black Caribbean woman with secondary multiple sclerosis provided a really kind of melancholy account of how she compared periods of really low mood, vacillating between recollections of being really vital and well, to being incarcerated in her bed. And she said, I don't go through depression like the MS nurse was asking me, but I do get depressed. There are days when I feel so sad that I have MS, because I feel I could do better. I mean, I'll give you a confession. I was watching Gene Kelly the other day on the TV, and I love Gene Kelly. In fact, I love anyone can dance. But at the same time, I loathe him. I hate him, because I'd love to do that too, but I can't. All I can do is just watch. I sit in the chair. I can't actually physically get up and do anything anymore, because if I did try and dance, I'm going to fall flat on my face. And my son will probably come in and say, what was that for, Mum? You know you can't do that. And although relatively underreported, cognitive problems or concentration problems were far more of an issue amongst our black Caribbean participants compared to their white British peers. And one of the main issues emerging in relation to concentration was not just the impact on them as individuals, but the sequelae of it, in terms of how they perceive that it impacted on other people's lives. And here I provide a very interesting account of a woman who said, I always used to have a good memory. Now my memory is very, very, very poor. Long-term memory is fine, but my short-term memory is really bad. That really upsets me, because I'd like have a talk with a friend today and arrange something for tomorrow, and if I haven't written it down, I'll go straight out my head. And I won't know until somebody calls me up and says, listen, I've been waiting for you on the street caller for ages. Where the hell are you? So that's really upsetting. We made use of 3 different approaches to calculate and explore the experience of disease progression or the rapidity of multiple sclerosis through these individuals' lives. The first was really to gauge from their clinical notes and their own accounts when they reached different points of physical functional decline. We identified that using the EDSS scores, which were peppered throughout their clinical records. The second approach involved calculating the progression index, which is referred to very quickly as the PI. And this involves a very simple and elegant calculation that makes use of the patient's current EDSS level, and that's pitched against the amount of time that it's taken to get to that point in time. But there's no real fixed consensus about how to calculate multiple sclerosis disease progression, particularly when you're using a kind of cross-sectional assessment. And this is where a very interesting tool called the multiple sclerosis severity score comes in, which enables you to import that individual's characteristics into a distribution of scores of people who have multiple sclerosis with equivalent disease duration. And I'm going to report on all 3 of those over the next couple of slides. In this slide that we see, again, based on patients or people with multiple sclerosis recollections of the onset of their disease, and also in relation to their confirmed clinical diagnosis from their clinical records, mapping through their clinical notes to identify different points in time that they experience physical decline using the EDSS scores, we were able to identify that our Black Caribbean participants raced to EDSS level 4 and to 6 far quicker than their white peers. You can see here that the median period of time for EDSS level 4 from diagnosis was 2.7 years compared to 10.2 years for their white peers. I'll talk about this later on in relation to the wider literature. And in relation to EDSS level 6, again, the difference between these two time periods is statistically significant. And after that, the gap narrowed, which is interesting as well. And if we look at the progression index, we can see that there are also some very, very interesting differences in relation to that calculation I referred to just a few moments ago. Both reveal statistically difference across the two ethnic groups that remained in place after we did some propensity analysis. And this is adjusted for the participant's age, their type of MS, and their EDSS at the time of the interview. So when we asked our participants what bothered or troubled them most about their illness, more Black Caribbean than white British people with MS volunteered views on the rapidity of their illness progression and their very, very dramatic decline. And this was underscored by feelings of disbelief, loss of control, and I think, which was very interesting, was this pervading sense of grief in relation to their sudden decline, which was often incredibly difficult for these individuals to accommodate. It was particularly difficult when their views were amplified by family or friends around them, which confirmed or validated how poorly they were in relation to several months previously. And I'll give you just an opportunity to read the slide here. There were also reports of multiple losses because some Caribbean participants spoke of being denied really important opportunities to engage in previously taken for granted activities of daily living that cement people together, like breastfeeding a baby, for example. And here, this woman said to me, I got ill so quickly. I lost the feeling down the left side of my body, and then I was okay, and then after about a year, my daughter being born, I got sick again. But I got worse. I had to go back on the treatment. I couldn't stay off the treatment. I wanted to breastfeed her for as long as I could, but I couldn't. I couldn't do it. You're upset and you're hurting, but you don't want to explain to other people and see other people to see that you're hurting, that you're crying. I didn't want that. Participants' biographies were also disrupted in very, very interesting and important ways as well, in terms of the very steep descent that they experienced. And in relation to that, the grief that they experienced en route, or rather their inability to accommodate those moments of grief. And here, a 60-year-old Black Caribbean woman with secondary progressive MS really exemplifies this. And she said, yeah, every now and again, I have to let myself grieve. You're having to go through that bereavement process again and again and again. And every time you lose another bit of you. And I remember the multiple sclerosis nurse saying to me, I would have thought you would have got used to this by now, but it's bereavement and I haven't. So now on to some methodological reflections, because we're coming around to time and it will be really interesting to talk with you. First of all, there are some really interesting issues in relation to the racialized differences between the researcher and the participant in terms of this race of interview effect. The idea being that if you ethnically or racially match a researcher with a participant, you get much better physical and psychological access to their truth. I think we're all hybrids though at the end of the day, which makes that kind of equation very difficult to work out, because you're also having to factor in social class and education and gender and age. I think we were really successful in recruiting people from both ethnic groups. I think it's important to state that Cassie and I are white British. And I think we developed enormous rapport with these folk over a relatively short period of time that suggests that that argument or facets of that argument may be a little bit flawed, but they're worthwhile keeping on the table nevertheless. I think it's really important to think carefully about the progression index and how it might be skewed more towards the higher scores and shorter disease durations rather than the lower scores with longer disease duration. And again, there's a very interesting literature around that. I think there are some very interesting issues in relation to recall bias, particularly when we're asking our participants to tell us about the onset of their illness. So some of the American studies, rather than focusing on months, have asked their African American participants to refer to seasons. It gives people a much wider window of time to identify what's going on in their life. We don't believe we had a problem in relation to that across our two ethnic groups. And I think one of the very interesting limitations of our study is that it was cross-sectional. We didn't travel with these people over a period of time. There are some very beautiful studies conducted by people like Steinhauser that suggest that if you develop rapport with people at the first interview, it's possible to continue with them over a period of time. We didn't have that lovely luxury of money in order to do that. That's a study for the future. So what does all of this mean? We know that aggressive multiple sclerosis is reported more frequently in the American literature. We're the first study in the United Kingdom to really catalogue it, to quantify it, but very importantly to provide a person-centred narrative to accompany that, to understand the meanings associated with that rapid momentum that these individuals experience from onset or clinical diagnosis to these several points in time which are associated with enormous loss en route. A variety of different reasons have been postulated to help understand why multiple sclerosis may be more aggressive in some individuals from different racial or ethnic groups compared to others. Again, MRI comparisons show that there's something going on in terms of disease accumulation and lesion accumulation in some individuals compared to what they always refer to as Caucasian white Americans. Again, this is something which needs and warrants more research. But what we have shown that there's enormous correspondence between the numbers, our calculations, and our findings numerically and the qualitative data to accompany that. Again, back to this vantage point of qualitative and quantitative saying something very interesting. We know that there were some very interesting issues in relation to cognitive impairment. And again, it's been hypothesized by Buchanan and colleagues that there's certainly a suggestion that increased physical disability at an early age may be associated with rapid disease progression that can lead to cognitive impairments. But most of that research has been done in adolescence. What remains unknown is whether this is fixed in time and whether people come out of these moments as their disease changes its characteristics. So, more importantly, we need to do prospective longitudinal studies. And I suggested earlier that there was enormous symptom burden across both disease groups, and also distress associated with symptoms. Many of them were rated as very severe and overwhelming on a scale from 0 all the way up to 4. And this was particularly so for fatigue and for pain and problems of ambulation. This compares well with very recent findings from Eli Silber and Irene Higginson and Rachel Berman and Polly Edmonds study that took place locally in southeast London. We know fatigue is a really big concern. It certainly was in the qualitative interviews, and it was meted out so well in the qualitative interviews to Cassie and myself. This is a very complex symptom. It's multifactorial, and the interventions to manage it are highly complex as well, and sometimes poorly understood whether they make a difference to these individuals. So what does this mean at the clinical interface? And this is where I would really welcome your views later on, because I'm just a jobbing researcher. I'm not a clinician, or better still, a neurologist. It's the first comparative mixed method study that's taken place across two ethnic groups, which I think is important because it has a currency that accounts and quantifies for the first time the lived experience of multiple sclerosis and what it means to these individuals. There are some very important issues in relation to functional decline, or the rapidity that our Black Caribbean participants went from diagnosis or the onset of their illness, which was usually several years previously, to these different moments of functional decline. And that was associated with multiple losses, which were articulated very well by our participants, but sometimes not fully understood or appreciated by the clinicians who were caring for them. There's certainly a suggestion that importing palliative care as a specialty for those individuals might enable them to live with identifying who they once were and thinking through issues of future identity as well. The delayed intervention that took place several years ago focused on quite a few of the psychological concerns that people who received a tailored service for people with advanced multiple sclerosis compared to best standard care fared much better. So why is this important? I think the study is important because there are growing numbers of people from Black, Asian and minority ethnic communities living in the UK compared to 20 or 30 years ago. And we know in relation to geoepidemiology that many more of them will start to live with, and in some instances die from MS. So we represent a moment in time in relation to understanding a single ethnic group. We conducted research amongst the Asian community, and I think I'm going to have to come back and present that at a different point in time. I'll leave you with one quote from Cicely Saunders in relation to how we sometimes retreat behind technique when we're working with social diversity, which is what's happening here. Cicely said, the resilience of those who choose to work exclusively in this field, and I think she means that very broadly, will be won by fully understanding what's happening and not retreating behind technique. If we're to remain for long near suffering, we need to develop a basic philosophy in search, often painfully, for meaning even in the most adverse situations. And I think what our participants have given us is a flavour or multiple flavours of what those meanings might be. Thank you very much indeed for your time.